He hadn't planned to stay more than a couple of weeks, just enough time to recover from the sting of failure and gather himself before moving on. It was supposed to be a pause, a breath, not a turning point. The house on the corner looked unremarkable from the street. White siding faded by the California sun, a small porch sagging slightly with age, but inside it carried a warmth that caught him off guard. The air held the faint scent of jasmine tea and polished wood, a smell that belonged more to memory than to the present. It reminded him of a place where time slowed, where silence had weight, and every detail seemed to hold meaning. At first he told himself he was only noticing out of restlessness, the way the light fell through the curtains or how the shadows lingered in the corners. But slowly, quietly, something shifted. The routine became different, charged with an undercurrent he could not dismiss. Each glance she cast in his direction carried an unspoken depth, as if words hovered behind her eyes but never found their way out. The silences between them stretched, no longer empty, but crowded with what neither dared acknowledge. What began as a temporary shelter turned into something else, something dangerous and irresistible. He felt it in the stillness of evenings, in the brush of her presence moving past him, in the hum of the house when the world outside seemed to fade. It was not loud, not dramatic, but it was undeniable. And though he never admitted it aloud, he knew a boundary had been crossed in his mind long before it would be crossed in reality. From that moment on, nothing returned to what it had been. The house was no longer just a house, and she was no longer just someone familiar. There was no path back to indifference, only forward, into a story he was both terrified of and drawn to completely. Fresno, California, 1999. The heat of summer hung in the air like a heavy curtain, pressing against the streets and settling in the dust that never seemed to leave the sidewalks. Days stretched slow and unhurried, filled with the sound of sprinklers ticking across dry lawns and the hum of air conditioners laboring in narrow windows. He had come back from San Francisco with little more than disappointment, a few clothes in a duffel bag, and a quiet shame he carried like a shadow. His plans had unraveled quickly, and pride kept him from admitting just how lost he felt. When his old friend left for a summer internship in Chicago, the offer to stay in the family's guest room seemed harmless enough. It was supposed to be simple, temporary, without weight. The Miller house sat on a wide corner lot, its white paint fading and porch steps creaking under the sun. Inside, though, it carried a life of its own. The kitchen was the heart of it, always warm, always holding the smell of bread, coffee, or something simmering on the stove. A small radio sat. It was in those moments that he began to notice the subtler things. The way she adjusted the sleeve of her sweater whenever she felt uncertain, tugging it down over her wrist as though it offered protection. The way she paused to watch a hummingbird outside the window, holding her breath as if afraid the slightest sound would break the fragile spell of its wings. These details etched themselves into him, small and ordinary, yet charged with a significance he could not ignore. One evening, the air thick with the scent of baked bread cooling on the counter, they found themselves seated across from one another. The table between them felt smaller than usual, the silence longer, more deliberate. He reached out, absent-mindedly, for the salt shaker resting near her hand. Their fingers brushed, a fleeting contact that should have gone unnoticed. But she did not move her hand away at once. For a brief, suspended second, their touch lingered. The world outside seemed to fall still. The steady tick of the clock faded, the hum of the refrigerator dimmed, and even the cicadas in the yard seemed to quiet. It was not a dramatic moment, not anything that could be explained if spoken aloud, yet it carried the force of revelation. Their hands parted at last, but the silence that followed was no longer the same. Something had shifted in the air between them, subtle but undeniable, a current that neither could retreat from. And though no words had been spoken, they both understood that the distance they once relied on had already begun to disappear. The rain began softly, a hesitant patter against the roof, before settling into a steady rhythm that filled the night with its quiet insistence. The house, usually wrapped in summer stillness, now felt cocooned by the sound, as if the world outside had been pushed further away. In the living room, the glow of the television cast shifting shadows across the walls, the flicker of an old black-and-white film playing to an audience of two. The air was cool, touched with the dampness seeping through the open window, and the scent of rain mixed with the faint aroma of detergent from the freshly washed curtains. They sat apart at first, careful in their placement, as though space itself could serve as a barrier. He leaned back into the worn fabric of the couch, his eyes fixed on the grainy images on the screen, though his attention barely clung to the story unfolding there. She sat with her legs folded, a blanket draped loosely across her lap, her posture relaxed but not careless. The silence between them was no longer neutral. It pressed in, filling with everything that had been left unsaid, with every glance that lingered too long and every moment of closeness that had gone unacknowledged. Then her knee brushed against his, lightly, almost imperceptibly, as if it had happened by accident. Yet she didn't move away. The touch was small, unremarkable to any observer, but to him it felt like the edge of something dangerous and undeniable. His breath caught, and for a moment he wondered if the sound of rain could conceal the sudden quickening of his pulse. He turned his head, slow, hesitant, until their eyes met. She was already watching him, her gaze steady but softened, lips parted as though she had just spoken, and the words were still hovering in the air. Her breathing was quiet, measured, yet he could feel the tension in it, the restraint that kept her from closing the space between them. His hand lifted almost of its own accord, rising into the charged air between them, hovering close enough to sense the warmth of her skin, but stopping just before contact. It was in that suspended instant, when silence was heavier than sound, that the growl of an engine cut through the rain. Headlights spilled briefly across the front window, sweeping the room in pale light before vanishing. Tires crunched against the wet gravel of the driveway, and the spell shattered. She reacted first. Her body tensed, and in one swift motion she stood, pulling the blanket tighter around her as though to erase the moment that had nearly happened. Her voice broke the silence, hurried and uneven, instructing him to go to bed, that it was late, that the evening was over. But beneath the words, beneath the practiced composure, her tone trembled, betraying the truth neither of them dared to face. The sound of the front door opening carried through the hall, the unmistakable sign that her son had come home earlier than expected. The house filled with a new weight, one that forced distance between them again, as if nothing had been risked. Yet the echo of that near touch lingered in the air, impossible to banish, impossible to forget. The morning began with the sharpness of raised voices, cutting through the stillness of the house like glass breaking. He woke to the sound, his chest tightening even before the words became clear. The air felt charged, heavy with something that could no longer be hidden. When he stepped into the hallway, the scene unfolded with the kind of clarity that left no room for denial. Michael stood rigid, his face pale, his hand gripping his mother's phone as though it were evidence of a crime. His eyes burned, wide with disbelief and anger, and his breath came in uneven bursts, each word dragged out under the weight of betrayal. The silence that followed was heavier than his accusation, a silence that begged for denial, for explanation, for anything that could undo what had already been seen. Sarah stood across from him, her shoulders drawn in, her gaze turned toward the floor. She did not speak, and in her refusal to answer, the truth became undeniable. Her silence carried more force than words, and Michael read it for what it was. His voice cracked as he spoke again, the sound raw, trembling between fury and grief. He spoke of trust broken, of the bond that had been twisted, of the impossible wound of betrayal from the two people he should never have had reason to doubt. The hallway seemed to shrink, walls closing in with the weight of the confrontation. When his eyes shifted toward the man standing there, they were filled with fire, anger, disbelief, and something deeper, an ache that could not be healed, flashed in his expression. Their gazes locked for only a second, but in that second everything was said. The loss of friendship, the collapse of trust, the end of whatever had been held between them. Michael's voice steadied enough for a single command. He told him to leave, each word clipped and final, leaving no space for argument. There was no plea, no hesitation, only the certainty of rejection. The choice had been made, and the fracture between them was irreparable. In less than half an hour the house became a flurry of movement. The sound of drawers opening, the hurried rustle of clothes being shoved into a bag, the dull thud of footsteps pacing back and forth. Sarah hovered in the background, her face pale, her hands trembling at her sides as though she wished to intervene but lacked the strength to do so. She reached out once, a gesture more instinct than intention, but her son pulled away, unwilling to grant even that small comfort. The final moment came quietly. Michael brushed past without another word, the strap of his bag tight across his shoulder, his steps hard against the floor. The front door opened, letting in a draft of cool morning air, then closed with a finality that echoed through the house long after he was gone. What remained was silence, thick and unforgiving. Sarah stood frozen in the hallway, her head bowed, as if the weight of her own choices had finally fallen fully upon her. He lingered at the edge, unable to move, knowing there was nothing he could say that would lessen the devastation. The house, once filled with the simple patterns of routine, now carried only the emptiness of something. Broken beyond repair. 3 months had passed, and the summer heat had given way to the dull heaviness of autumn. He had taken a small apartment above a pizzeria in downtown Fresno, a place where the smell of baked dough and oregano drifted up through the thin floorboards each morning. The walls were cracked, the paint faded, but it was enough. He worked long hours at a warehouse, moving boxes from one place to another, the monotony leaving little space for thought. His days were marked by routine, his nights by silence. He lived, but the sensation of living had grown faint, as if something vital had been left behind in that house on the quiet street. On a Sunday morning, he walked through the open-air market, the air carrying the scent of roasted coffee and ripe fruit. Vendors called out their prices, children tugged at their parents' hands, and the simple rhythm of ordinary life unfolded around him. He kept his head low, his focus narrowed to the task of buying bread, as though blending into the crowd could erase the shadows of the past months. It was near the strawberry stand that his steps faltered. She was there, framed by the colors of summer's last harvest, her hand lingering over the fruit as if choosing carefully mattered. Time seemed to fold in on itself, collapsing the distance of months into a single moment. She looked different, though not unrecognizably so, her posture straighter, her face calmer, though touched with a weariness that had not been there before. She carried herself with quiet strength, as though she had been forced to rebuild from the inside. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, wordless but undeniable. She approached, her movements steady, her expression composed. When she asked how he was, her voice was even, gentle, neither accusing nor longing. He answered honestly, admitting that he was holding on, nothing more. When he asked in return, she spoke of learning to breathe again, and in those words lay the acknowledgement of how much had been broken and how much had been endured. They shared a smile then, small but genuine, unburdened by expectation. There were no promises, no talk of what could come next, only the quiet recognition of a connection that had left its mark. The market bustled around them, strangers moving past without pause, yet in that brief exchange the noise seemed to fade. When they parted, it was without the ache of unfinished sentences or the heaviness of regret. The memory of that summer remained, carved into them both, not as something to return to, but as proof that even fleeting love could alter the shape of a life. Sometimes love was not meant to remain, not meant to bind two people together forever. Sometimes it was only meant to remind them, in the midst of loss and change, that they were still alive.